Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Palestinians confront Israeli occupation on Land Day. Pakistani lawmakers debate reopening NATO supply route. And Egypt's Ganzouri government to face vote of no confidence. Mosaic, world news from the Middle East, begins now.
On the 36th commemoration of Land Day, a Palestinian was martyred near the Beit Hanun crossing by the gunfire of the occupation forces. 20 others were injured during massive demonstrations held for the occasion. Marches were launched from the Gaza Strip in Arab countries towards the border to take part in the global march to Jerusalem, which was called for by Palestinian activists. Meanwhile, the Palestinian territories witnessed demonstrations in a number of areas, during which clashes broke out between Palestinian youth and Israeli occupation forces. At the military checkpoint between Ramallah and Jerusalem, dozens of youth threw stones at Israeli soldiers who responded by firing tear gas and stun grenades to disperse the protesters. Clashes erupted shortly before a march planned from the Kalandia refugee camp towards the military checkpoint on the occasion of Land Day. The occupation's authorities imposed a complete military siege on the West Bank for 24 hours. Shirin Abu has the details.
The city of Jerusalem woke up to its constant siege. The world's attention was on the city, but the occupation's control of the city was stronger. Thousands of Israeli forces were deployed in the city, its surroundings, and its entrances on the occasion of Land Day. The Palestinian territories were completely sealed off for 24 hours. The fuse for the confrontations was quickly ignited. Male Jerusalemites under the age of 40 were prevented from entering the Old City to perform prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque. Occupation forces attacked Palestinian youths with their horses, batons, and tear gas. Some youths were injured and a number of others were arrested by the Israeli occupation forces. Around the city of Jerusalem, the atmosphere was just as tense. At the Qalandia checkpoint that separates the city from the northern West Bank, hundreds of Palestinians gathered to participate in a centralized march. The march did not reach the military checkpoint. The occupation's forces mobilized hundreds of its members and confronted the march with tear gas, rubber bullets, causing additional injuries and asphyxiations.
This is a great day for the rise of the Palestinian people's popular resistance. This is a day to strengthen the contemporary Palestinian revolution, the day that begins the Palestinian Spring.
Our message to the international community is that there is a people being robbed of their land every day. There are pervasive settlements violating international law.
One of the familiar methods used to crack down on peaceful protests is skunk water cannons. Regardless of the different methods it uses, Israel is not able to suppress Palestinian protests since it continues to confiscate their land.
We are seeing fewer protests, and we hope we can completely get rid of them.
There are approximately 150 settlements in the West Bank, including Jerusalem. Nearly 500,000 settlers live there. Palestinians say they threaten the possibility of establishing the state they dream of. Yet another heated day in the life of the Palestinians, a day linked to this specific occasion. But it should be known that 40% of the West Bank's land is threatened by settlements and the separation wall. So, even if the situation calms down, it remains ripe for an escalation. Shirin Abu Akleh, Al Jazeera, from the Qalandia checkpoint north of occupied Jerusalem.
Protesters gathered at the Jordanian-Israeli border to mark Land Day. Palestinians living in Europe and other parts of the world took part in the demonstrations, as well as Jews from the Jews United Against Zionism movement. They demanded an end to Israeli occupation. Hundreds of Palestinians and Lebanese also gathered in southern Lebanon to commemorate Land Day. Demonstrators rallied near the border with Israel in the village of Arnoun, raising Palestinian and Lebanese flags and chanting slogans against the Israeli occupation. The Tunisian capital saw protests after Friday prayers to commemorate Land Day. Protesters raised slogans expressing their support for the Palestinian people and condemning the occupation. They also demanded the criminalization of normalizing ties with Israel. Political groups and parties organized a rally in front of the Constituent Assembly in the Tunisian capital, demanding the implementation of a constitutional article that criminalizes any form of normalization with Israel.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is keeping the threat of a nuclear Iran on the forefront in order to divert attention from pressing domestic socioeconomic problems. Well, this claim comes from new Kadima leader Shaul Mofaz during a variety of interviews that he's been granting media outlets since his primary election victory. Saying that he doesn't trust Netanyahu to competently handle the Iranian issue, Mofaz said that the Prime Minister is dealing with the matter much too publicly when it should be handled behind the scenes. Mofaz warned that a premature military operation would be disastrous and limited in its effectiveness. The former Minister of Defense said that he would support a military strike if there are no alternatives, but he stressed that now is not the time for such an action. A spokesman for the Likud party responded that Mofaz should not be offering advice on Iran, given how wrong he was when he insisted that Israel's 2005 disengagement from Gaza would improve national security. British Foreign Secretary William Hague also addressed Iran during a speech on foreign policy. Speaking in London, Hague said that Tehran should not doubt the determination of the major powers to stop it from acquiring nuclear weapons, while he simultaneously suggested that international sanctions would be eased if Iran makes concessions. The British foreign policy chief also addressed negotiations with Iran over its nuclear development program, slated to be resumed in April after more than a year of hiatus.
We approach these talks with sincerity and a genuine desire for a breakthrough. This can only come if Iran enters the talks in a new spirit. We are not seeking regime change in Iran. We look to the Iranian government to prove to the world that their nuclear program is for peaceful energy, not for nuclear weapons, and to give up any plans to acquire them. Iran's isolation is not in the interests of the Iranian people. Iran faces unprecedented sanctions, and from the 1st of July will no longer be able to export crude oil into the European Union. It is in the Iranian government's power to end this isolation, and if they negotiate seriously on the concerns over its nuclear program, we will respond.
Joining me now in the studio to discuss recent regional events is Bloomberg in Israel senior correspondent Kalev Ben-David. Good evening, Kalev.
Pleasure to be here, Aaron.
Thanks for coming in on this Land Day, which didn't turn out to have quite the oomph that the organizers had promised. There were no deaths. There was nothing similar to the events that took place last May on Nakba Day when the border was successfully breached and there were several shootings. Can today basically be considered a victory for Israel?
I mean, I wouldn't use the word victory per se, but I do think the most significant thing today was what didn't happen, and you made reference to that. We didn't see these massive demonstrations on the borders with Lebanon and especially Syria that we saw at the Nakba Day last year. That is a reflection of changes in Syria, of course, the Syrian situation, not going to have protests coming from Syria now into Israel and certainly in Lebanon. So in that sense, I think Israel can certainly, in the Netanyahu government, breathe a certain sigh of relief that those events didn't happen.
Do you believe that the Palestinian strategy is failing, or is Israel just successful in dodging bullets, let's say, until one of these crises turns into a major disturbance?
Well, you know what? When I talk to my Palestinian sources, there is some frustration on their end. They feel they're taking some actions, like today, some of the diplomatic action, and it's not getting, for example, the media coverage that it's gotten in the past. The media's been much more focused on the Israel-Iran issue and events elsewhere in the region, and in that sense, they're not gaining the kind of traction diplomatically. But we'll have to really wait and see, especially after the U.S. election in November, if the United States will then put its pedal to the gas to the pedal on the diplomatic efforts, and some elections that are being held also of course, in France. So we'll just have to wait and see. And this time, though, yeah, there's frustration on the Palestinian side.
Pakistan's parliament has formally opened a debate on whether or not to reopen the supply line for the US-led troops in neighbouring Afghanistan. The majority of the lawmakers urged the government not to allow transportation of arms and ammunition. Some groups opposed the reopening of the supply line altogether. Others argued only food items be allowed to go through. Islamabad closed the supply line in November 2011 after a US airstrike killed over 24 Pakistani soldiers. The attack severely strained relations between Islamabad and Washington. Public anger at the US has also grown significantly over the past year. Moving on with the news, protesters in Yemen have taken to the streets across the country calling for freedom. The protesters also called for the government to sack all members of government affiliated with the old regime. They especially called for the relatives of deposed leader Ali Abdullah Saleh out of the political picture. The rallies come after Friday prayers held in several cities, including the capital Sana'a and the southern city of Taiz. Yemenis want Saleh and his aides to stand trial for orchestrating the killing of nearly 2,000 protesters since last year. Saleh was replaced by his deputy after a single-candidate presidential election in February, backed by the US and Saudi Arabia. The protesters accused the US and Riyadh of trying to derail their revolution. Human rights group Amnesty International has urged the government of Bahrain to release prominent activist Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja. The rights group has warned al-Khawaja's life is in danger. He's been on hunger strike for over 7 weeks. He's lost 16 kilos since he stopped eating. Khawaja has been held since April of last year. He was jailed for organising and participating in rallies against the regime. He's among the thousands of people arrested since the government launched a deadly crackdown on dissent last year.
The Secretary General of the Lebanese resistance movement says dialogue in tandem with reform are the only way forward to resolving the Syrian crisis. Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah said Syria has already promised reform and dialogue and that it's up to the opposition to take advantage of it. He criticized the Arab League for completely ignoring the crisis in Bahrain at Thursday's summit in the Iraqi capital Baghdad. He said there's a human catastrophe taking place in Bahrain with people being killed every day. He also criticized countries that are going with an Israeli agenda to push the Palestinian cause into oblivion. Nasrallah also praised the turnout at the Palestinian Land Day demonstrations. Visiting US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has met with Saudi King Abdullah in the capital Riyadh. The unrest in Syria reportedly topped the agenda of the talks. This comes ahead of a meeting of anti-Syria countries in Istanbul on Sunday. Saudi Arabia and some other Arab states have joined efforts by Western countries to overthrow the Syrian government by arming opposition groups. Syria's year-long unrest has claimed thousands of lives, including those of security forces.
The Egyptian People's Assembly is continuing the process of withdrawing confidence from Kemal al-Ganzouri's government due to its failure to solve the country's issues. The ruling military council held a meeting with party representatives to look into dissolving the government and forming a constituent committee to draft a new constitution for the country after some of its members resigned and Al-Azhar refused to participate in it.
It seems the crisis in Kemal al-Ganzouri's government is continuing. The Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party held a press conference to announce it will begin the process of withdrawing confidence from the government. The party denied the military council's threat to dissolve the People's Assembly if the Brotherhood's ministers insist on their demand to dissolve the government.
We are not afraid of any threats. We do not accept the threats of dissolving parliament, and we do not work with the aim of gaining power or a position.
All committees of the Assembly discussed the government's program, and all 19 committees refused the government's program.
We will not give the government a vote of confidence. If we do not, then the current political authority's duty is to dissolve that government. If it does not dissolve it, then it will be instigating crises that we cannot endure at this point.
It seems the relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood Summit in the Military Council has reached an unprecedented level of tension in light of the fate of the Ganzouri government. This led the People's Assembly to hold an important session to respond to the government's latest statement. The answer to the government's statement was clear, as committees rejected it and pointed to the government's failure to manage the transitional period. Other representatives accused government ministers of taking money from private funds. This led some ministers to withdraw in a scene that expresses the real crisis between both sides.
Tell us how much you take out of the private funds. Tell us the number of these private funds. Sir, until this day, the government has still not announced the number of private funds or how much money they contain.
The government does not take any money out of private funds. This is a false accusation. The government does not take any money out of private funds.
I challenge him. I will resign if he has any documents on me, if there is any proof that I took 1 penny from those funds.
Politically and away from the media outlets, the Military Council held a meeting with various political party representatives to reach an understanding on the dissolution of the government and the Constitution's Constituent Committee. This after a series of repeated resignations from the committee and Al-Azhar's complete rejection to participate in that committee. Islam Abu al-Magd, Al-Alam, Cairo.
French police have arrested 19 suspects to question them on their affiliation with Islamist radical groups. The suspects were arrested in several French cities, including Toulouse, where French police killed Mohamed Merah, who was accused of killing 7 people. Following Merah's death, the Paris district attorney said investigations will focus on the search for possible accomplices. President Sarkozy ordered police to evaluate the level of danger posed by those known to sympathize with radical Islamists.
بتعاطفهم مع التطرف الإسلامي بحسب تعبيره.
The case of Mohamed Merah, who announced his affiliation with al-Qaeda, is still raising many questions over his motive to carry out a crime that claimed the lives of 7 French citizens. The siege, which ended with Merah's death at his home in the southern city of Toulouse, didn't suspend the French authorities' search for those described as collaborators and accomplices to the crime. Arrest operations were launched across the country. French police said 20 people with a radical Islamist background have been arrested, adding that the arrests were not directly linked to Merah's case.
These detentions are not directly linked to Mohamed Merah's case, as confirmed a short while ago by a French security source. The raids targeted a group calling itself Forsan al-Isa, or Knights of Pride, which was dismantled after its members called for disrespecting and burning the French penal code. The group also called for protecting women who wear the niqab or full veil and preventing police from harassing them. Weapons were seized from the group.
Agents from the French Domestic Intelligence Agency's Central Command carried out the arrest campaign, with elite raid police units providing support in some cases. The arrests were concentrated in Toulouse and the Nantes region. The raids came 1 day after the burial of Mohamed Merah in the Muslim section of a cemetery in Toulouse, with the participation of 30 youths from his neighborhood and the absence of his family members. The burial caused anger among Toulouse's residents, who said burying a person with ties to al-Qaeda in their city is inappropriate. However, amid the French president's intervention in the burial arrangement, the threats by Mohamed's father to sue the French state for killing his son, and the intensifying competition for the French presidential office, all sides seem to be pursuing their own political interests, even if it comes at the expense of national security and humanitarian concerns. Deaths and injuries were reported following anti-regime protests on the Friday of "The Arabs and Muslims Let Us Down" as clashes broke out in a number of areas in Syria. Meanwhile, UN Arab League envoy Kofi Annan asked Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to immediately implement his plan.
Muslims and Arabs have let us down, but God is with us, and our resolve will bring victory. This was the slogan of this Friday's protests in Syria. Some were killed and injured, according to opposition sources. Participants in the protests chanted for the downfall of the regime and condemned the initiative of the Arab Summit in Baghdad. A demonstration was held in the Jubar neighborhood of Damascus. Security forces attempted to disperse the protest. Regime forces also dispersed demonstrations in Al-Qadam neighborhood as activists confirmed security forces clashed with protesters in the neighborhoods of Al-Qadam and Al-Maidan in the center of the capital. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights and opposition websites, protests were held in some areas, while other regions witnessed fierce clashes between regime forces and members of the Free Syrian Army. Most notable clashes broke out in the towns of Douma, Harasta, Arba'in, and Al-Ghouta in the countryside of Damascus. Activists asserted a military checkpoint in central Arba'in city was targeted, killing one soldier from the regime's forces and damaging a military vehicle. Meanwhile, the local coordination committees reported violent clashes this morning in Gharb al-Mashtal district of Hama between the regime's army and the Free Syrian Army, as well as clashes in the Ghassan Aboud area of Deir ez-Zur. In Damascus, the observatory confirmed that security and army forces stormed the neighborhood of Barza and carried out a raid campaign on houses surrounding the square, where protests are organized. The observatory reported Syrian forces began a military campaign in the town of Jarjanaz in the countryside of Ma'arrat al-Na'man in Idlib province. Meanwhile, opposition websites uploaded images asserting violent shelling is targeting the neighborhoods of Homs city, specifically Bustan al-Diwan, al-Hamadiyya, al-Safsafa, Deir Ba'allaba, and Bab Tadmur. Politically, a spokesman for the international envoy said Syrian President Bashar al-Assad should implement Annan's plan immediately. He said military operations continue on the ground, and that is causing great concern. He indicated the violations and killings should stop immediately. This comes as the United States imposed sanctions on Syrian Defense Minister Dawood Rijaha and two senior officers in the Syrian army, Mudir Adanov and Zuhair Shalish. The sanctions include freezing their assets and barring Americans from doing business with them. At the same time, representatives of a number of countries are meeting on Sunday in Turkey for the Friends of Syria conference to increase the pressure on Damascus and push it to adhere to Annan's plan to end the violence. It is expected for 17 countries to participate, including the US, but excluding China and Russia, to determine measures that guarantee the regime will not withdraw from its commitment to the plan President Bashar al-Assad agreed to.
Residents of the town of Al-Qa in the Bekaa Valley appealed to the Lebanese government not to distance itself from their lives and their properties.
Nearly 24 hours later, the Radi family returns to their house in Masharia Al-Qa after having been displaced, and this is what they found. It looks as though war passed through here, while it hadn't. A few soldiers from the Syrian forces penetrated the Lebanese territory. They opened fire and launched rocket-propelled grenades at an opponent that remains unknown.
The Syrian army entered our homes and started to fire mortar shells, and they fired at the homes and damaged them. They displaced us from our homes. We fled. We ran away.
They entered dozens of houses and damaged them. Their humanity did not prevent them from destroying a room that housed Syrian refugees or a vehicle carrying wounded Syrians to Lebanon for treatment. They stole whatever they were able to steal and destroyed whatever their hands and rifles could reach. They even stole water pipes and threw them in the garden. Cautious calm dominates the scene while citizens continue to live in fear. These residents were forcibly displaced to surrounding groves and their relatives' homes. Their resentment is mostly directed at the Lebanese government, and the question, "Where is the government?" is no longer a satirical saying.
The Syrian army entered 500 meters into the Lebanese territory. If they have a revolution, then Syrians must work on it between each other. We, the Lebanese, can only provide humanitarian aid, nothing else. Humanitarian work is our duty, but that's it. I tell you, the situation is extremely tragic. Tragic because of the shelling and the arbitrary gunfire. So we had to flee because we're near the border while we're inside Lebanon.
Assad's brigades, who have not found anyone to deter them from undermining Lebanon's sovereignty, felt no shame to occupy some houses which were used by snipers to control the entire area. Even fleeing to Lebanon is no longer safe. For these refugees staying in shelters that lack life's most basic necessities, security has become increasingly elusive. They turn their faces away from the camera while their children still have tiny hopes and dreams because of their youth.
We ran away from death and we came here. It's better than dying in Syria.
When are you returning to Syria?
When the situation is calm.
Here, a rocket fell. And here, Russian-produced shrapnel. And at this exact spot, the Lebanese government is completely absent. The residents of these villages call them the empty quarters because those who are supposed to guard and guarantee their security are nowhere to be seen. These bullets refute claims made by those who denied Lebanese sovereignty was undermined, sovereignty that's now based on a mere opinion. When sovereignty is breached in the south, wars break out. Once it's breached in the north and east, denial is the response. From the border town Al-Ka, Dareen Al-Hilwe, Future TV.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wyncote Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic. Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.